Have you ever seen a man disemboweled alive, whispering, "Let me die," as steam rose from his open stomach? His voice wasn't pain, it was panic staged for a crowd. This wasn't justice, it was a performance. Because what happened to Hugh Despenser the Younger wasn't an execution. It was a political exorcism. They didn't just kill him, they erased him. Organ by organ, scream by scream. All because he dared to reach too close to a crown that wasn't his. I've studied dozens of brutal deaths throughout European history, but nothing compares to what they did to Despenser, an orchestrated ritual of destruction designed not just to punish but to send a message. In this video, you'll uncover why power doesn't protect you, it isolates you. How one man used the king's love as both shield and sword, and how in medieval England hatred alone could become law. Hugh Despenser was once the most powerful man in England after the king. Within months, he was stripped, flayed, and butchered in front of thousands. No trial, no mercy. Just a nation, hungry for revenge. Stick around, because once you see how a man can be unmade in public, you'll understand. Death isn't always a punishment. Sometimes, it's a message. He was naked from the waist down, mutilated beyond recognition, and muttering the same 4 words over and over. "Let me die." His lips were blistered black, his voice barely more than air escaping a furnace of screams. He twitched, not with life, but with the mechanical desperation of a nervous system overwhelmed, short-circuiting, failing. The crowd watched in stunned silence as steam rose from his flayed abdomen, mixing with the damp November air, carrying the sour stench of scorched flesh and iron-thick blood. They had cheered before, but now they stood paralyzed, no longer sure if they were spectators or accomplices. This wasn't an execution. It was a political exorcism. They weren't killing a man. They were erasing him, organ by organ, breath by breath. Every second of agony was deliberate, choreographed for spectacle, and every blade of it meant to send a single message. This is the cost of rising too high, too fast, and too close to a king. The broken creature clawing the ground beneath him was once Hugh Despenser the Younger, England's most powerful man besides the king himself. Now he was a horror show of pain, pleading for death that refused to arrive. He was not granted a clean hanging or a merciful beheading. He was dissected in front of a nation, publicly, ritually, because a simple death would have been too kind. That was the point. But to understand how a man born into nobility ended up disemboweled before a frothing crowd, we need to return to a kingdom where power was theater, torture was a language, and execution was the stage. In that world, suffering wasn't collateral, it was currency. This isn't the story of a man who died poorly. This is the story of a man who was unmade, his body, his name, and his soul dismantled before the very realm he once helped rule. And it all began, as it often does, with ambition. He wasn't born to rule, but he was born close enough to feel its heat. Hugh Despenser came from noble stock, loyal to the English crown for generations. But he didn't want to serve the monarchy. He wanted to bend it. From an early age, Hugh displayed the most dangerous traits a royal favorite could possess: fearless ambition, magnetic cruelty, and a loyalty so complete it devoured reason. He became King Edward VI's favorite companion. Then his obsession. Whispers circled that their relationship was more than political. Historians still debate it, but the court didn't need proof. Rumor alone made him shine and rot at once. Despenser wielded royal influence like a weapon. He rewrote titles, seized land from widows, imprisoned rivals without charge, and reshaped England's hierarchy with a pen dripping in self-interest. In less than a decade, he rose from noble son to the most hated man in the country, and he knew it. Every game brought a new enemy. Every whisper became a dagger drawn in daylight. Records from the time paint him as ruthless, greedy, and unrepentant. He blackmailed, threatened, manipulated, using Edward's affection as both shield and sword. Whether those tales were true, exaggerated, or political fiction doesn't matter. Perception was the verdict. Rumor was the noose. By 1326, the barons who had gritted their teeth through Despenser's tyranny had had enough. Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, returned from diplomatic exile with not just a lover, Roger Mortimer, but an army. And with her came a reckoning not just for the king, but for the man who had corrupted him. But before the knives, Before the fire, before the scaffold, Despenser had to be stripped, not just of rank, of identity, of personhood, until the only thing left was the monster the kingdom needed him to be. And the kingdom was ready. He wasn't born to rule, but he was born to touch it, to taste its edges like a child circling fire. Hugh Despenser the Younger came into the world already orbiting power. His family was noble, loyal, respected, but never central. Yet that wasn't enough. Not for Hugh. From the start, he was restless in the role of servant, too clever, too sharp-eyed, too hungry. What he saw in court wasn't just pageantry, it was an open wound, and he intended to pour himself into it. Unlike his father, who moved carefully within tradition, Hugh moved like a knife, fast, decisive, and always pointed toward the throne. He mastered the art of flattery, courted the king's favor with precision, and waited. When Edward the Sue's first favorite, the flamboyant and divisive Piers Gaveston, was brutally executed by resentful nobles, that space beside the king became a vacancy. Hugh filled it like water seeps into a crack, silently, inevitably, and with pressure that split everything around it. He didn't dazzle like Gaveston. He calculated. His rise was quiet at first, a whisper of appointments, a murmur of titles, land accumulating like storm clouds. Then, as his influence swelled, the whisper became a roar. Hugh was no longer just the king's confidant. He became his shadow, his voice, his gatekeeper. By 1322, Hugh Despenser controlled who approached the king, who rose, who fell, who lost everything. He manipulated courts, seized estates, and funneled power into his own hands with surgical cruelty. Enemies were nearly defeated. They were erased, exiled, imprisoned, or, more often, hung with charges dressed in royal parchment. And yet, he wasn't satisfied. Power is a hunger that grows even as it feeds. Hugh wanted not just control, but permanence. He wanted his name carved into the architecture of monarchy. But every land he took, every noble he humiliated, every whisper of his relationship with Edward the Sceau, true or not, turned the court into a boiling kettle of hate. The English nobility, already simmering with resentment, began to see him not as a man, but as a parasite, a leech, a disease dragging their king into disgrace. The mood shifted, subtle at first. Cold glances in the hallways, allies becoming silent. And then came the queen, Isabella, French-born, regal, and long underestimated. She had tolerated Hugh Despenser for years, endured the erosion of her influence, the confiscation of her lands, the hollowing of her marriage, but she was never weak. When the balance tipped, she didn't cry foul. She crossed the channel and returned not as a consort, but as a conqueror. With Roger Mortimer at her side, a man who once rotted in Despenser's prison, she carried an army, a grievance, and something Hugh had never expected, the will of the people. What followed wasn't rebellion, it was retribution, cold, righteous, and already breathing down his neck. By the time Isabella's ship sliced through the English Channel, it wasn't a rebellion waiting for her. It was a nation on the edge of ignition. Years of humiliation had primed the nobility like dry kindling. Heavy taxes bled the peasantry. Lancezures, orchestrated by Despenser under Edward's seal, had stripped families bare. Towns that once offered tribute to the crown now whispered open curses. There were no loyalists left, only the afraid, and even fear was wearing thin. And so, when Isabella stepped ashore with foreign mercenaries and the vengeful Mortimer, she didn't meet resistance. She met relief. Nobles defected in silence. Cities opened their gates before a single sword was drawn. The people called her queen not with loyalty but with desperation. Edward and Hugh fled west, not like monarch and counselor but like criminals. They disguised themselves in tattered robes and clung to a fantasy that the tide would turn. But England had already made its decision. The kingdom they once ruled had slipped from their fingers like sand, and now it turned against them with righteous, almost theatrical fury. Every step of their escape bled dignity. Edward, the once king, trudged through back roads in borrowed shoes, but Hugh remained defiant. His hair still oiled, his boots still polished. Witnesses said he barked orders to the very soldiers escorting him, as if he believed the farce of his fall could still be rewritten. It couldn't. They were caught outside Neath Abbey. The king was spared, imprisoned, yes, but treated with the trembling deference still owed to a fallen sovereign. Despenser received no such courtesy. He was thrown across a gaunt horse, wrists bound behind his back, face smeared with the mud of his own collapse. The villagers didn't bow. Some called out names that had once been whispered behind guarded doors. Names like devil, whore, worm. Children threw rocks. Old men shouted the names of sons lost to Hugh's ambitions. No one needed a verdict. He was guilty of something deeper than treason. He had ruined the myth of kingship. And that, in a kingdom built on spectacle, was unforgivable. He was dragged to Hereford, not led, dragged. The journey was slow, intentional. A pageant of shame. Soldiers let the public approach. They allowed the jeers, the filth, the blows. This wasn't transport. It was degradation. Every mile peeled off another layer of his past grandeur. Every slap, every curse, every clod of earth thrown into his mouth reminded the realm that the man who once held England in his fist now belonged to no one. Even the mud refused to cling to him. But what awaited him in Hereford wasn't just death. It was a reckoning shaped by hands more cunning than the executioners. Isabella and Mortimer didn't simply want him gone. They wanted him unforgettable. They wanted a spectacle so brutal it would be carved into the minds of children, etched into the sermons of priests, embroidered into the very flags that fluttered above cities. They would not kill Hugh Despenser to satisfy the law. They would kill him to instruct a kingdom. And for that, they needed time. They needed a stage. They needed pain. He arrived in Hereford not as a prisoner of war, but as prey delivered to the altar. He was filthy, skeletal, and visibly trembling. Yet the hatred he inspired still burned so hot it lit the cobblestones beneath him. No trial awaited him, only an audience. Soldiers paraded him through the streets like a trophy, his hands bound with coarse rope, his fine garments long since torn away and replaced by rags soaked in travel, sweat, and shame. The air was thick with the scent of rot and wet wool, the echo of jeers bouncing from stone walls. Spectators poured from alleys, women with baskets, boys with stones, old men with memories. They didn't just watch, they spat, they cursed, they named their dead sons and ruined farms and gave those losses a face. No official charges had been read yet. No judge, no defense. But the people already knew his crimes. Not just treason, not just theft, but the greater sin of bending the king to his will, of turning royalty into ridicule, of reaching so high that the sky itself cracked under the arrogance. He wasn't called Hugh anymore. He was the leech, the corrupter, the beast in the throne room. The Queen and Mortimer made no move to calm the crowd. They didn't have to. This was part of the sentence. He was being dismantled publicly, not just physically, but symbolically. For days, they kept him locked in Hereford Castle, under watch, but not for protection, only to preserve him like meat, unspoiled for the theater of blood they were preparing. He wasn't given wine or comfort, only silence, thick and heavy, where time was weaponized into dread. No date was announced, no warning. Just the slow, steady knowledge that something worse than death was coming. And then, without ceremony, the announcement came. He would be hanged, but not to die. Castrated, but not cleanly. Disemboweled, but not swiftly. Beheaded, but not to end it. Drawn and quartered, but not to disappear. Every step was ritual. Every wound a sermon. He would be dragged by horse through the streets, because walking would preserve a dignity no longer afforded to him. He would be hanged just long enough to taste the edge of unconsciousness, then cut down to feel it all. He would be mutilated in the groin, not just for vengeance, but for implication, for the rumors of perversion that had haunted him like ghosts. His intestines would be pulled from his living body and burned before his eyes. His heart would be removed last if it hadn't already burst from pain. Then his head would be severed, not as release, but as punctuation. And finally, his body would be divided into 4 pieces, each one sent to a different corner of England, nailed to the gates of cities that once bowed to his signature. He would not be buried. He would not be remembered. He would be scattered, like a curse blown apart by fire. That wasn't justice. That was a message. And the realm was listening. The morning came not with trumpets, but with a silence too thick for breath. Cold mist wrapped around the scaffolding like a shroud waiting to be lifted. There were no courtiers, no parchment, no robes of law, just a makeshift platform, low to the ground, stained with the blood of Simon de Reading, Despenser's fellow loyalist, executed only hours earlier. His final screams had barely cooled in the air when the crowd returned, hungrier now, eyes gleaming, boots stomping into the half-frozen mud. Vendors set up stalls along the perimeter. Children sat on shoulders. It wasn't a courtroom, it was a carnival. And in the center of it all, the man who once commanded kings stood in rags, tethered to a wooden drag frame like a carcass pulled from slaughter. He didn't walk to his execution. He was hauled, face down, dragged through filth and gravel, every stone along the way biting into his ribs and tearing open skin. Villagers lined the path, some with rotten vegetables, others with nothing but hate. They watched him pass with the awe of those witnessing something divine, something terrible and holy. A woman spat into his eye. A boy, no more than 10, laughed as he hurled a shard of bone. The guards didn't interfere. They were actors in this theater now, not protectors. His agony was part of the script. When they reached the platform, he was already bleeding, already gasping. His cloak was gone. His body was bare from the waist up. His skin the color of ash, stretched tight across bones, marked with bruises and cuts. He was hoisted to his knees, not with ceremony but with force, arms yanked into place, his wrists bound against a beam. There was no priest's blessing, only a quick mutter of Latin as a man of the cloth appeared beside him. More witness than savior. Hugh's lips moved, but no one heard. Perhaps it was a prayer. Perhaps it was nothing. The rope was slung fast around his neck. Not for death, not yet. Just enough tension to lift him. Just enough time to taste the brink. His feet kicked the air. His mouth opened in a soundless scream. The crowd surged closer, shrieking not in fear but in delight. They had come for pain, and pain had arrived. After seconds that bent time, the rope was cut. He crumpled like a puppet with its strings severed. His body convulsed on the wood, blood leaking from nose, eyes, ears. But he was alive. That was the requirement. Then the real spectacle began. Two men, masked, practiced, professional, stepped forward with blades not sharp enough for mercy. The first cut was slow, precise, carved between his legs, a gesture as symbolic as it was cruel. They removed what made him a man and held it aloft like a prize. The crowd roared. Then, without pause, they tossed it into the fire at the foot of the stage. Flames hissed, flesh cracked. The smell turned the front row green, but no one turned away. And Hugh didn't scream. Not yet. His body convulsed, jaw clenched, hands gripping at air that could no longer save him. But when the second cut came, along the stomach, slicing deep, a rupture of blood and steam, he howled. Not words, not speech, just sound, primal, bottomless, the kind of scream that still echoes even when the body that made it is long gone. They held him down while his insides were pulled out like rope, glistening in the morning light, twitching with dying warmth. He watched, or tried to. His eyes were half blind, one already swollen shut. His lips were moving again, slower now, thick with blood. Let me die. Let me die. Let me die. Let me die. There were still organs to expose, still lungs to crush, still a heart that beat, faintly, beneath the ruin of a man who once thought himself untouchable. And it was still beating when they reached for the axe. They waited just long enough for him to register it. What was coming? Not mercy, not relief, just the dull rhythm of inevitability. His body, barely recognizable now, lay curled on the slick boards of the scaffold, trembling. And in the center of that crimson stage, his chest still rose, still fell, still defied the ending that should have come long ago. But it was the eyes that haunted the crowd, one swollen shut, the other glassy and wide, darting from face to face as if trying to memorize them, or curse them, or beg one last time for escape. It didn't matter which. No one stepped forward. The executioner didn't raise a sword, nor some royal French blade with ceremonial flourish. No, what he lifted was rough steel, English forged, dull-edged, made not for grace but for force. A cleaver built to butcher, not to cut. He gripped Hugh's hair, sticky with sweat and blood, lifted the ruined head back and swung. The first strike didn't finish it. It never does. It split skin and muscle, sent a spray of blood onto the boards and into the gasping mouths of those too close to look away. Hugh convulsed. A thick, ragged moan escaped his throat, wet and bubbling, more sound than voice. The second blow cracked through vertebrae. The third separated the head completely. The executioner raised it high, arm trembling from effort, as the crowd exhaled like one enormous beast, finally fed. But there was no cheer, no roar of satisfaction. The moment hung there, suspended like the dripping head itself, heavy, eerie, and stained with something darker than justice. His mouth hung open, lips curled, frozen in a shape that looked like pain but could have been a prayer or a curse. And even then, it wasn't over. They laid his body flat, what remained of it, limbs splayed, belly torn, heart gone, chest caved in like a broken cage. Assistants stepped in, hooded, silent, and began the final task. Axes came down with mechanical rhythm, cracking joints like firewood. One arm, one leg, then the next. The sound of splitting bone echoed down the street, each swing a punctuation mark on the saga of a man, now reduced to parts. The crowd watched not with horror, but with fixation, like spectators at a dissection, eager to see what secrets hid inside the fallen. Each limb was wrapped in burlap, tagged, and loaded onto horses already waiting, steaming in the cold. York, Bristol, Newcastle, Dover, each to receive a piece of the message, each to nail him to their city gates. The torso, hollowed and discarded, was set to flames. No headstone, no forgiveness, no forgiveness. Ashes and bone dust scattered in the wind. But still the story did not die, because this wasn't the end of Hugh Dispenser. It was the beginning of his myth, or his damnation, depending on who was telling it, and who still remembered what they saw, or what they did. For Isabella, the death of Hugh Dispenser was never the end. It was a beginning, a proclamation. The scaffold at Hereford wasn't simply a killing ground. It was a stage from which she declared the rebirth of royal order. But even the most brutal execution fades if not followed by something more permanent. So they turned next to what outlived the body. The story. Within hours, scribes went to work. The man once titled Lord of Glamorgan became the leech, the corrupter, the filth. His greed ballooned in ink. His ambition became perversion. His influence, disease. Even the silence of his last hours was twisted into cowardice. Any honor he had once worn was now dragged through the same mud that soaked his entrails. The message was clear. His destruction had not been enough. His memory, too, had to burn. Church bells rang not for mourning, but for cleansing. Priests called him an abomination. His name vanished from the rolls of landowners. His family lost everything: title, land, protections. They were not merely punished. They were erased, as if bloodlines could be cauterized like open wounds. Banners bearing the Dispenser arms were torn down and burned in marketplaces. Mothers warned their children not to speak his name, as if it alone might summon misfortune. And in 4 separate cities, people passed beneath his severed limbs nailed to the gates, silent, glancing upward as if the parts might still twitch in recognition, as if punishment could reach beyond death and into legacy. But perhaps the most terrifying part wasn't what they destroyed. It was how easily they did it. With no trial, no defense, no resistance. No one stood for him. No one protested. Power had shifted so completely that even the thought of dissent had vanished. It was not justice. It was ritual. The murder of memory dressed up as divine retribution. And the silence that followed, that was the most damning proof it had worked. Because long after his bones had turned to ash, long after the last drop of his blood was scrubbed from the boards, Hugh Dispenser still hung there, in stories told to frighten children, in whispered cautionary tales behind castle walls, in sermons that promised what happens to those who fly too close to power and forget they are mortal. And yet, deep down, a question lingered in the eyes of those who watched, who cheered, who turned their backs before the final blow. Had they witnessed justice? Or had they participated in something far colder, far older, something closer to sacrifice? No one dared ask aloud, but they remembered. And so, The man who once held England's heartbeat in his palm was reduced to smoke, splinters, and silence. Hugh Despenser's death didn't simply end a life. It was engineered to cauterize an era. His body was torn to pieces. Yes, but his name was the true casualty. By the time his limbs reached the corners of the realm, he was already legend. A monster, a seducer, a shadow cast across the throne. But strip back the sermons, the chants, the charred scripts of moral triumph, and what remains? A man, flesh and blood, destroyed not only for what he did, but for what he symbolized. The truth, of course, is never so clean. Did he corrupt a weak king? Or did he become the king's last defense against a court rotting from within? Was he the architect of tyranny, or a weapon wielded by a monarch desperate to be seen? The chronicles never agree, because they were never meant to. They weren't written to remember him. They were written to bury him twice. Once in dirt, once in history. Yet there's something about the way the crowd went silent when the heart was pulled from his chest. Something about how even the executioner flinched before the third blow. Something about the way people still whisper his name like a curse that might stick to the walls if spoken too loud. What does that say about us? Was his death justice? Or was it vengeance dressed in robes, sharpened into ritual, and delivered with the blessing of a kingdom craving absolution? You've heard the story now. It's pain, it's spectacle, it's orchestrated horror. But the question still lingers, doesn't it? Did Hugh Despenser fall because he reached too far, or because he showed us how fragile the crown really was? And if power can erase a man so completely, what does it take to remember him? Tell me, what do you see when you look into the fire?